So first I'd like to welcome everyone here to the South in Black and White. This is an official Brooklyn Book Festival bookend event, and it is co-sponsored by Brooklyn Social Media and the Old Stone House. So I'll tell you a little bit about the flow of tonight's event. We're going to have a panel discussion that Louise Crawford will moderate with our four authors who I'll introduce in a minute. And that panel discussion will last for approximately 40 minutes. And after that, there'll be a Q&A of about 15 minutes, followed by a book signing. There are books here available for sale. Okay, and then of course, if we run out of books, all the books are available at the usual places online. Bathroom is right across the hall if you need to go there. So also I want to read a short statement by the Brooklyn Book Festival. We're proud to be an official 2024 Brooklyn Book Festival bookend event. Bookend events in person in all 5 boroughs and online run from September 22nd through September 30th and are a vital part of the Brooklyn Book Festival's mission to present programming that is quote, hip, smart, diverse, and inclusive for New York City and beyond. We hope you can join us this weekend in downtown Brooklyn. The Brooklyn Book Festival's Children's Day is this Saturday from 10 to 4, and the Festival Day and Literary Marketplace is on Sunday, this Sunday, from 10 to 6. And we have festival guides here that are available.
Yeah.
And if you don't already have one, we can get you one before you leave. And now I will introduce the authors. As I mentioned before, Louise Crawford, who is the founder and leader of Brooklyn Social Media, will be doing the moderation of the panel. So we have Millicent E. Brown, who is a retired associate professor of history at Claflin University, also having taught at several other institutions of higher education. She is a lifelong community advocate and spokesperson for improvements in historically exploited neighborhoods and communities of color. Currently, she consults with museums, historical sites, and organizations seeking more accurate analyses of social justice initiatives. Millicent lives in Charleston, South Carolina, and is the author of the new memoir, Another Sojourner Looking for Truth, My Journey from Civil Rights to Black Power and Beyond. Then we have Pete Candler, and Pete Candler was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. He is a writer, photographer, and filmmaker whose work has appeared in Los Angeles Review of Books, A Bitter Southerner, Washington Post, and elsewhere. He lives in Asheville, North Carolina, and is the author of the new travel narrative, A Deeper South, The Beauty, Mystery, and Sorrow of the Southern Road. Okay. Then we have Deborah Clearman. Deborah Clearman was born in North Carolina and grew up on a farm in southern Maryland. In addition to her new novel, The Angels of Sinkhole County, she is the author of 2 novels, Remedios and Todos Santos, that are actually also, we have a couple of copies here if you're interested in those, and a collection of short fiction, Concepcion and the Baby Brokers, and other stories out of Guatemala. We also have that here, yes.
Yep.
And The Goose's Tale, a children's book she wrote and illustrated. Her short stories have appeared in numerous literary journals. She was active in the former New York Writers Coalition and the Village Community Boathouse, and Deborah lives in New York City. And as I said, she's the author of The Angels of Sinkhole County. Last but not least is David Nicholson. And David Nicholson is a former editor and book reviewer for the Washington Post Book World and author of Flying Home, 7 Stories of the Secret City. which the Los Angeles Times included on a list of books that, quote, show us where to find the real America. The Publishers Weekly had it as one of, quote, 7 essential Washington, D.C. books that aren't about politics. He studied creative writing at the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop. He has worked as a reporter in San Francisco, Milwaukee, and Dayton. He lives in Vienna, Virginia with his wife and son, and is the author of The Family History, The Garretts of Columbia, a Black South Carolina family from slavery to the dawn of integration. So with that, turn it over to Louise.
Yeah. I was just going to add that there's a lot of history here in this group. No, there are people who've done historical things. There are people who observe. Anyway, there's a lot of very interesting stories here. And I just wanted to add that when Millicent was 15, she was the lead plaintiff in the federal case that forced the start of public school desegregation in South Carolina. A big part of her, what she has to say in the book, and it's incredible. And I want to thank David for coming up for the title of this event, The South in Black and White, because I think it's such a good title, because we are talking about race, black and white. We're also talking about writing. We're also talking about news, black and white. We're also talking about a non-binary kind of cliche versus nuance. We're really looking in a kind of nuanced way at the South. So I think it's a great title. So it's about this is about a lot of things. So it's a challenge. I want to read a quote from I think it's the first page of Pete's book that kind of opens things up a bit. This is from A Deeper South. To tell the story of the South truthfully requires a multiplicity of voices, perspectives, tones, accents, styles, vocabularies, and disposition. One problem with big, comprehensive stories is they do not allow you to be troubled by them, so long as you are inside of them. So I thought that was kind of a great way to open. There's a lot going on here. So, kind of coming out of that idea, voices and ways of looking at the South, I was just wondering if each of you could say where you're from, and describe in brief, to tell the audience, to give them a sense of your book. And just to add, there are 3 memoirs and 1 work of fiction. So Pete, do you want to start? And we're going to talk a lot about everyone's book, so you can keep it short, but they don't know what's...
Okay. Well, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. And that's it. In a family that is pretty well known in Atlanta, and that's a big part of my relationship to that, not just the family itself, but the way the family story is or is not told, or stories, I guess, became a big part of this book. And it started out with a kind of innocent road trip in 1997, and that I did with a friend of mine from high school for a number of years. And then we had the opportunity we took a big pause, and then we sort of rebooted them in a very different culture. This is 2018, a very different cultural context in which questions about race were just on the front page every day, and they were often related to specific. I think one of the things that was interesting about that particular period was that these questions were attached to particular geographical sites, and sometimes even material objects like statues. And these were things that we had seen on our trips many times. So the book tells really the story about the sort of transformation of my perspective, both on the region and on my family's history within that region, and how selective memory or willful amnesia really shapes the sort of public memory of the region as a whole, and in my family in particular. And then ultimately that led to a kind of self-examination about how has all of this stuff sort of imprinted itself on me.
David?
Oh, you're going order.
I know we can get some of these.
No, that's okay. I should have been thinking about what I was going to say.
Yeah, it was enchanting when I was talking, wasn't it? It was really rhythmic.
My book is, I call it a warts and all family history. It's basically the story of my...
A little louder. Here, you might as well use the mic. You got it.
Is that any better?
Oh, yeah, it's over.
What I said was, my book is a warts and all family history that begins with it begins with an ancestor who bought us freedom in the early 1800s. But the story is primarily of my great-grandfather and his wife. He was a lawyer, professor at Allen University, and an activist in the AME Church. He got fired from his job teaching at Allen, and his wife had to go to work, and she became a supervisor of what were then called rural colored schools in Richland County, South Carolina. This is not history that I've lived. So when you said there are 3 memoirs, no, they're not. There are 2 memoirs. There's one family history. And I always felt a little awkward about it. I don't want to say too much to keep you from buying the book. But part of my reason for wanting to write about my great-grandparents was that though I was born in the United States, I grew up in Jamaica, and when I came back, I was faced with this conundrum. What is it to be an American? And, you know, I'm way past the age when I first came back, but it's still a question that occurs to me now. Do I understand what it is to be an American? And so writing this book, in part, was, you know, to excavate that family history. I still feel a little awkward about it. I was in Columbia earlier this year, and I thought before I went about bringing down the gym bag and setting it on the lectern and saying I couldn't find a carpet bag. So this is going to have to do it. So that's all to say. I feel a little bit like an interloper, but I don't know. Enough people have told me they liked the book and got something from it. So I think maybe I really did have accomplished something.
Oh, I think so.
Oh, thank you.
Deborah?
Okay, well, mine is a novel, The Angels of Sinkhole County.
Can you hear?
Oh, yeah. And, but I will confess from the get-go that it is based on a lot of personal experience. So I grew up mostly in southern Maryland, and when it was pretty segregated, public schools, and experienced a lot of that. My parents and my brother moved to West Virginia when I was in college. And although I never lived there for more than a summer, several summers, but it became my home. But like David, I've always felt like an outsider wherever I lived. I lived in New York for most of my adult life, but I still feel like an outsider. So The Angels of Sinkhole County is the story of an old man who dies at home of old age, and he's surrounded by caregivers. And caregivers are heartbroken, and they also don't want to lose their jobs. So one of them comes up with the brilliant idea of switching out the old man for his identical twin, his double, another old man that this woman had been taking care of. And that happens in the first chapter of the book. And then from then on, the question is, are they going to be able to get away with this? And I like to call it a hilarious story about death and deception. And when my parents were aging in their home in West Virginia, and the house was full of caregivers, the caregivers all said to me, "Oh, Deborah, you're going to write a novel about us, aren't you?" And I have to say that some of them have been the biggest fans of my novel, so I'm very pleased with that. So I guess that's all for now.
I am a native of Charleston, South Carolina, and when asked what the book is about, it was the closest thing I could do to writing a memoir that didn't talk about myself. Oxymoron, okay. I have been doing academic writing for 20 plus years and thought very seriously that I did not want to do like so many of my scholarly friends who write books for each other. And so this was an opportunity to, yes, impart some history, because I was a history college professor, but I wanted to impart some history, hopefully offer some behind the scenes, less known aspects of social justice movements that I was involved in. But I didn't want it to be in jargon. I wanted it to be accessible to a much broader range. Younger, older, didn't matter, but just a broader range. And so I attempt to talk about what it means to be Black in America, sharing some intimate early experiences, and then asking you to just kind of travel with me around the whole country and to see the changes that I went through philosophically and what have you, which also reflect changes that the country was going through at the same time.
Thank you. Could each of you sort of give us a sense of the process of writing your book and research, whether it's a road trip, research, whatever it was? And I'm going to start with David, because I think the first line of your book is, "It took me 60 years to write this book." And I think that's the beginning of the weary integrationist. But if you could just sort of briefly, and everyone, to give us a sense of sort of how you set about writing the work that you did.
Well, my mother made me do it. My mother was a librarian at the Library of Congress, and shortly before she retired, she went into the attic of the family home. It's the home that my grandfather bought in Washington, D.C. in 1928. And my sister still lives there, and so we're all hoping we can hang on another 4 years to celebrate 100 years of this house baby in the family. Anyway, she goes into the attic, and she finds all these boxes and trunks and suitcases full of letters and diaries and photographs, dating back probably to the late 1800s, like the 1880s or 1890s. And she unfortunately could not write this book. She had suffered an aneurysm, and though she, was able to learn how to read and write again, not to the extent that she had done when she was getting a master's degree at the University of Chicago. So she never twisted my arm and said, I want you to write this book, but she left me all of these documents. And I didn't open the boxes for years. They moved with me 3 or 4 times before I finally opened and began to organize them. And I realized, boy, there's some pretty incredible stuff here. I would talk to friends and they would say, I have nothing like this. I don't have that kind of record. So, not to take up much more time, I transcribed all of the letters, transcribed some of the diaries, and I used those as kind of a basis to construct the narrative. But I had to fill in a lot of the blanks. They would mention people, and they wouldn't say so-and-so pastor of such and such church, they just say so-and-so. And I would have to figure out who that person was and how he figured in the sort of cultural life of Columbia at that time. I really should, I was thinking as I was doing some research last week that I should keep a notebook about research, because for me it's just kind of like happenstance and serendipity. I wonder if, and then I start looking at something and then another question arises, and then that leads to another question, and before I know it, I've spent 2 weeks researching the topic of alley life in Washington, D.C. So I can't talk much about the research except to say there was a heck of a lot of it, and there was 10 or 12 years.
And you've essentially written the history of your family, from slavery.
Well,
it's incredible.
up until the death of my great-grandparents. I'm working on another book now that begins with my grandparents' courtship in Columbia. Again, I'm lucky to have their letters, the letters that they exchanged when they were courting and when they were breaking up and when they were getting back together. And so I'm writing about them, and then their move to Washington, D.C. as part of the Great Migration.
Pete, you want to pick up the question of your process, how you wrote this book?
Well, yeah, oh, sure, yeah, I'll take my, I think when we started doing these road trips, I had in the back of my mind an idea that maybe I would write something someday about it, that was about 20 plus years before it was time. And it was actually a friend of mine in Asheville who's a historian, like a real historian, not like a fake one like me, but who used to direct the Center for the Study of the American South at UNC Chapel Hill. He said to me, oh, I want to have lunch with you. There's this book I'm reading, I want to tell you about it. He goes, it's called At the Altar of Lynching, The Burning of Sam Hose. And I said, well, I'd never heard of Sam Hose. And I was only beginning to learn a little bit about the subject of lynching. And I was intrigued, and I thought, that sounds like a very intense book. I think I should read that. He goes, yeah, your family comes up in it a lot. And I was like, I'm not sure I want to read that book. But that was really the turning point in my whole perspective. That I realized that was the first kind of moment when I realized there's so much about my family's history that I don't know. And there are some really dark aspects to it that have been, deliberately hidden for generations. And so I immediately started writing. I knew that this was a book project. There's another conversation about a road trip with another friend in California who nudged me to write an essay based on a trip that we hadn't even taken yet. So that was an incredible act of trust. But really the way the process, I think one thing I should say about the character of these trips that John and I did, and we've done about 10 of them together, has always been, we had 3 rules. There were no interstates, no maps, and no hotels. We still keep the no interstates one. The other 2 were a little softer on these days. Maps still, we try to avoid them, but the idea was we just sort of follow the road. And I came to realize that in the course of writing, well, I'll say more about that maybe later. But in terms of the process of the book was very much like the road trips themselves, and I wanted the writing process to kind of partake of that same somewhat improvisational, spontaneous quality. Sort of like David, I mean, that really resonated when you were talking about sort of following rabbit trails. There's so many rabbit trails I followed that didn't make it into this book, but the sense of just following your nose, both as sort of when you're doing a road trip and then writing a book. The only thing I'm really trained in at all is research, and my background is in academia as well, in theology, and at a research university. And so this book kind of constantly goes back and forth between storytelling, the narrative of my experience of being in a place, like the Mississippi Delta, for instance, and then the research part of it that sort of goes deeper. And with that dynamic was partly accidental, but partly, or maybe it was an accident that became an intention, because the whole ethos of the book is looking back with different kinds of eyes and seeing what you might not have noticed before, which is part of why photography is so important to this project and to me personally. So, because the other thing that, in terms of the process that really got this going, were the thousands of negatives that I had from these trips that had just sat in a box for years, and I again thought maybe I'll dig them out and do something with them. Well, so when I went back and looked at these images that I had taken from all over the South, in many cases for the first time in years, I was seeing things that I wasn't even aware were there. Even in the images, in the prints or in the negatives, there's this quality to the world that I had seen that I hadn't really seen, if that makes sense. So, and that power of photography to continue to reveal the world to you, even when you're not, I think one of the things that I found so fascinating was I saw things that I didn't even intend to photograph. Like, they were in images that, whatever, my intention was, the final, the image transcended that. It exceeded my own intention. So, but then the photography also became a kind of cue to memory, and memory is really the theme of this book. So it became a way to, in a very pragmatic sense, remind myself where I was on August 15th, 1997, for instance. And that required talking to John, my sort of co-pilot, who has a much better memory than I do. So lots of layers for me to the process. But basically, the short answer, which I should have just left it at maybe, was that the process was very much, I think, intentionally of the same ethos as the process of writing the book was. I wanted it to be of the same kind of spirit of the trips themselves.
Thank you. I was just going to add to the black and white, we also have photography. And you're going next, but I was going to say you have David's letters and you have Pete's negatives. And Millicent, what was your process to decide? You decided you were going to write a memoir, but that wasn't about you.
The secret is I got old. That's basically what the process was. It was a realization that I use unabashedly with every audience that I speak to, and that is, I think everybody should write a recollection of their lives, you know, whether it gets published or not. And so I went to this project first having had to decide that what I had experienced in my lifetime, my 7 decades or so, that had value and that if shared would have some meaning to it. But very early on I realized, okay, I accept, I embrace a certain part of the role that I played in history that will be part of my personal legacy. But it was very early that I said, everybody needs to do this, you know. How do we convince people that what they experienced may not have made the front page of a paper, may not have ever gotten published, doesn't matter. We have got to encourage the recollections and the memories and the insights and the perspectives. And so my process was to just go decade by decade, but city by city, and talk about what I remember seeing, and then trying to expand it. Okay, this is what I saw, but if you read this chapter, what was it that you were going through at that time? You know, and that's what I hope to be encouraging with it. You know? I am a trained historian, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm quite accustomed to doing academic writing, and so it was fun to say, nope, I don't have those kind of constraints. Let me just roll with it and be comedic if I want to be, and throw in that history, and always remind folks all along the line that this is just one woman's perspective. You know, don't read my book thinking that I have come up with all the answers to how we're going to deal with race problems in America. You know, don't have that capacity. But the perspectives just sort of hopefully open up other questions for each of us to answer.
So I guess it's my turn, and of course, I've been told I should write a memoir, but I can't write without lying. So I just have to tell lies. And I will say that I had my material. I love place, I love setting, I love West Virginia. I had characters. The characters that were surrounding me were just larger than life. And what I needed was a good lie to tell that got me started. And then when I write fiction, I don't outline, I don't know how the thing's gonna turn out. I just start with a preposterous idea and take it one chapter at a time. So, well, gosh, now what happens next? And all of my work I've written to find out what is going to happen. I had things that I wanted to explore, which I've explored in my other works of fiction, things about class, things about, a lot about social class, which comes into this novel a lot. There's not a lot about race, because the part of West Virginia that I lived in is almost entirely white. There is, of course, racism, but deeply classist and a lot of nuance. And so that interested me, because, I like complexity, I like nuance. I also started out as a visual artist, And so when I write, I have to see the scene. And I also have to orchestrate it. I have to see people coming in and out of rooms. And so that is my process.
All of you have traveled you've traveled a bit with the book. You've been in, various places talking about the book, reading the book. Is there such a thing as the Southern reader? If so, how do they differ from the Northern reader? And if you want to address Southernness, Northernness, whatever, however you hear that question, anybody want to start?
No.
Well, I have really some interesting experiences because I went on book tour. I went to West Virginia and to North Carolina, and I grew up in a border state, Maryland. West Virginia is also a border state. And so I never thought of myself as a Southerner. In fact, I thought of myself as a Yankee, although I was surrounded by people who were still fighting the Civil War on the wrong side. And when I got to West Virginia, I didn't think of it as a Southern state either. But I quickly found that a lot of the people that I ran into did think of themselves as Southerners. And, we Southerners like our sweet tea. And, but then there are other parts of West Virginia that don't consider themselves to be Southern. And I found that very interesting. And one of the things, and I'm starting to lose my train of thought. It's racing down the track. I did run into a lot of what we're seeing now all around us, and particularly in West Virginia, a sense of grievance among whites, being stereotyped as being ignorant and poor, and it was very revelatory to me that these people who lived in this wonderful place that my family had adopted, and a lot of people, Vista workers, hippies, had moved to West Virginia because they loved it so much. But the natives there, things that we thought were cute, the shacks and the kind of the, whatever, they hated the idea of being poor. And I realized that there was privilege on our part of being able to come in to this beautiful kind of scenic place without having the history, the burden of history.
Anyone else?
Okay, time's up. I don't know that I have anything to say about this, but based on a conversation I had this morning with an old friend, I've been sort of wondering whether blacks and whites experience my book differently. This isn't Southerners. And I was thinking about how, for one reader, was really struck by how my great-grandparents, I call him Papa and her Mama in the book, was really struck by how they, were grieved by their children leaving. They left the South in search of greater opportunity. Many of them went to New York. My grandmother went to Washington, D.C. And for some black readers, they see the book as extolling the black middle class. They see it as kind of rectifying the wrong. We've got Snoop Dogg on the one hand, and on the other hand, you've got the black middle class folks in my book, people who, were literate back around the time of the Civil War, people who valued education, people who sent their kids to school. So I'm not sure that what I know about that is worth what I just said, but it's what came up for me when you said that.
I'll take a stab at the northern question in Brooklyn. Seems ill-advised, but I don't know. I mean, I think there was a time in maybe half a century ago when writers felt confident in speaking about this southern sort of character. There's a famous book by W.J. Cash about the Southern mind. Sorry, the mind of the South, yes. My Southern mind is not so sharp. The mind of the South, which basically it's an amazing book, and it's very influential, by the way. W.J. Cash's story is even more amazing. But I think we've probably lost confidence in the idea of there being something called the mind of the South or the mind of the North. I don't think these are necessarily stable categories. If anything, I think what and the other thing is, like, both of these regions have diversified so much in the last half a century since Cash wrote his book. No relation to Johnny, by the way, but that a lot of these demographic divisions are a lot blurrier than they once were. But the one thing that I feel like I learned, not so much from the book tour as from the trips themselves, especially kind of the latter ones, was how different each state is in the South from every other state. Even though Georgia and South Carolina are right next to one another. And it took me years to realize how different they are. Culturally, they're part of the South. They're part of. You tend to think of these things as monolithic, but there can be, no more like a Southern mind as if there's probably not even a South Carolinian mind. We've got a lot of at least some South Carolinians on this panel who can speak to that. But within the South itself, there are smaller micro regions. I began the book, and I'll end with an anecdote from when I was a graduate student in England. And the very first dinner I sat at, it was the first time I ever met a Canadian. I guess there are not many Canadians in Atlanta in the 1990s. Or at least they didn't identify themselves as such. But this Canadian sits across the dinner table from me and says, the thing about the United States is you can travel all over the country and everybody basically talks the same. Yeah. I was like, this isn't a good way to start my relationship with Canadians, because I think, there have been studies about, actually my brother who's here from New Orleans was telling me the other day about a study a scholar who wrote a study of a linguist about the diversity of accents you can point to Atlanta itself, there are different accents within different neighborhoods. So there are thousands of different ways of speaking. There's no Southern accent, much like there's no British accent. There's no Northern accent. So the fact that there is so much complexity within these categories, I think, is one of the things. I feel like my experience of reading your books was that that same sense of kind of discovery. There's so much range here that I didn't know any of this stuff. And Anyway, so, yeah, not so much about north and south maybe, as just because I haven't really spent most of my time in that region, but it's a lot more diverse than I even thought it was.
Melissa, your book takes us on such a journey of your life, from South Carolina to Boston, back, all the places you've been. But do you want to address this question about the South?
I want to agree very quickly with everything you just said. You know, there's just too much difference to try to hold on to old labels like that. But I want to take it a little further. Because when I heard this question, it kind of bothered me. I'm not sure how I identified. Did you mean my audience, or because the audience happened to be located either up north or, I just wasn't sure exactly where we were going with this. And I was reminded that for all kinds of book tours and book conversations like this, let's be reminded of who it is that has access to the resources and access to the ability either to read or who takes advantage of these kinds of opportunities. That to me did not change no matter where I was meeting people and talking with people. You know, folks who turn up at book talks are the same, whatever city you are in, wherever you are. And so that vantage point, I just wanted to say, to remind us that the privilege of the literary life and literary investigation still is pretty limited to certain groups of people, which is not defined by race, but certain groups of people who have access.
I think we've got, are we at the point where we want to do the question?
We can go 5 more minutes with questions.
Okay, so I would, for the last question, I was going to say, okay, here's your book list. And I don't know, I think anyone here's, has anyone read any of these books? Oh, great. And we'll embark on reading them, and if you could just say what it is you would like the reader, or you're hoping the reader. Is there a truth? Is there something that you would like the reader to get out of this book that you've written? Who would like to take that? You can laugh at me now.
Well, let me see. I think what I would like, one of the things I would like people to take away is that race is both important and not important in the book. One of the things that really astounded me as I was reading, the letters and journals was how little race comes up. There are all kinds of historic events that happened. There was never a lynching in Richland County, which is where Columbia is in, and which is sort of the focus of my book. But there were lynchings outside 10 or 15 miles away. Those are never mentioned in any of the letters. Red Summer, I don't know how many of you know what Red Summer was, but Red Summer after World War I, there were outbreaks. I'm trying to remember the phrase that how one historian characterized them. White anti-black mob violence. Anyway, all throughout the country, mobs of whites attacked blacks. And in some cases, in Washington, D.C., black men went up to Baltimore and bought rifles, and they came down and stationed themselves on the rooftops in case the mobs, came into their neighborhoods. My grandfather was in Washington during this time, and there's no mention of it at all. And I was really puzzled over this, and I talked to a historian, and she said, well, what you have to realize is they all knew what was going on. So they're not going to write about, I had to get on the Jim Crow car, or this, that, or the other. So, yes, their lives were defined by race, but within that context, they just did phenomenal things. My great-grandmother writes about building 2 schools, overseeing the construction of 2 schools. My great-grandfather
was an alternate delegate to, gosh, I'm blanking on the date, but to the Republican National Convention. So that's one of the things that I would like people to take away. This is a cohort of people who created a loving, nurturing world that allowed them to withstand the dangers of segregation.
What about you, Deb?
All right. Well, I think that my book is all about love, and this is caregiving, people of, some of different economic backgrounds, educational backgrounds, different class, but bound together by love. And I think that caregivers in our society are not given credit for what they do. And so that's pretty much the deeper message in my book.
Which one was?
I think, I will just say what the question that guided me in writing this book, the one that I had always in front of my mind when digging up, whether it's digging up sort of disturbing family history or troubling just Southern history, or encountering a place where reckoning with this stuff in space, like the Emmett Till story is a big part of that journey for me. The question that I always wanted to keep in front of me was, what does any of this have to do with me? And that's the question I want to hand on to the reader, is what does any of this have to do with you? And if you have that, I hope the reader can bring that same question to the stories in this book, and other stories, obviously, that are more applicable or more immediately relevant. Because I think that insofar as Americans we have any relationship to history at all, which is negligible at best, it tends to be very abstract and a textbook subject. But we are part of it. It's the one sort of subject, like this doesn't apply to calculus, but it's the subject that we are actors in. We are subjects of history. We're creators and makers of history. And we are, absolutely, we are inherit history and bear it within ourselves. So that's
Two very distinct things that I really do hope are the punch that people will take away from my work. The emphasis on the word another, the idea that we must stop elevating individuals through history, and even as we analyze and sympathize with struggle, we've got to learn to stop thinking that certain individuals by themselves were responsible for any kind of social change that we are seeking. And so the word another was very deliberately used to just remind, I'm just a voice that I'm adding, but please don't forget the people who did not get identified through time, the unknowns through time. Striving for some kind of improved standard of living for people of color. The big thing for me, however, is understanding that, especially as a Black woman, talking about experiences of race and class and whatever. How do we understand that change does not necessarily mean progress? Of course, we have had changes in our society, many of them for the better, of course. But I looked at my landscape, which ended up being the whole country, and realizing that just because we may shift and make certain changes, we must be very careful deciding whether or not we have progressed in identifying all of humanity as being worthy.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we've come to the part of the program where we're going to be looking for some questions from the crowd. Any questions? Yep.
Hey, how are y'all doing? Thank you. I want to go back to the question about the Southern reader. And I agree with y'all's points. I'm from New Orleans. The point the two of you were making about the mini Souths, it's not, this monolith, right? And I want to hear from each of you, if I may, what are some geographic specificities to each of your Souths, your micro Souths, that impact your relationship with the written word and that might impact your reader from your South's way of approaching your text?
Well, I'll go first and say that I'm not really sure that it's applicable. I'm writing about this.
Face, yeah.
I'm writing about a place and a time, but I never lived there, and so I'm sort of writing about it as an outsider. In a way, you maybe identified something that I'm just seeing as a failing in the book, in that it doesn't give a sense of place, and I wish it did. The book I'm working on now is largely set in Washington, D.C., which is a city that I know, and I hope that it's going to have much more of a sense of place.
I think, in my case, I first identified West Virginia as Appalachia rather than the South. And I think that mountain culture is extremely strong there. It's also interesting because the native West Virginians have a very rooted quality to them. And they go back generations. And I came from a very mobile family, so I don't know whether that really answers your question, but that's kind of where I came from.
I'll try. That's a very nuanced question. I'll try to do some justice to it. I talk about so many different places in the book that I think I'll just limit myself to my hometown because that's the one I know probably the least, actually, now that I think about it. And that's sort of my point. I think there's a sort of unformulated hypothesis under all of this book that's place determines what is, in many ways, place determines what is possible intellectually or in thought. And because I have had certain sort of moments of revelation, in terms of ideas or and their sort of personal impact that could not have happened except in the very specific place of encounter on a road, in a cemetery, where they happen. And the book is full of these kind of convergences that are totally unexpected. And for me, that is where you encounter history most powerfully, where I encounter history most powerfully is on foot, and just by being in a particular place. As far as Atlanta is concerned, I think one of the things, in a way, this is kind of what, I'm not sure if I could have written this book if I wasn't from Atlanta, because the city is so it has staked its flag in the sort of ground of progress through commerce and an indifference, not just an indifference, but a hostility towards history in a way that is still very much alive. I think this is something I did not anticipate. That's what I did learn on the book tour, was how deep that goes. Still, and the just like getting certain people in Atlanta, my people, affluent white Atlantans, to think about, to care about history, like Atlanta's history or their history, or our family history, in a way that matters to each of us personally. Like it determines your fate in some way. Not to sound grandiose, but Southern literature is full of grandiose sort of themes like fate and stuff. But that was proven to be more of a challenge than I realized, because the kind of urge to say something good, positive, like let's end on a happy note, is, it is very powerful. In a way that I did not encounter that same kind of sort of resistance in places like Mississippi or Alabama, because Atlanta has really built its identity on that principle of the kind of.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's
but
fine.
as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about that phrase, "a city that was too busy to hate."
Yes.
Which ignores the race riots and
Sorry.
No, it ignores the race riots and ignores. I can't remember his name. William Jefferson White, the newspaper editor who published editorials, anti-lynching editorials, and they threatened to. Actually, I think they did burn his newspaper. So there's this. We were talking earlier about how we ignore history. That whole slogan of "the city too busy to hate" ignores that history completely.
Yeah. If
If you're too busy to hate, you're too busy to love, and you're too busy to give a shit about your own role in the universe. So, sorry about that. But yeah, that was William Hartsfield who coined that phrase. Was a longtime mayor of Atlanta and a great advocate for this this idea. And by the way, there wasn't, in Atlanta's case, there were some positive things that came out of that. One of them was this legacy of, this gets sort of overblown sometimes, but the legacy of the coalition, or the sort of the biracial cooperation, that the sort of pact that was made between white business elites and black political leaders in Atlanta that goes way back. The Olympics is a result of that. It is one of the greatest fruits of that kind of coalition. But yeah, so it's no accident that the airport named for William Hartsfield, who coined the term "the city too busy to hate," is proudly the busiest in the world. Not the best, but the busiest.
I think I'm going to complicate you just a little bit, because part of my goal, I think, in sharing these experiences is to show that you can see in a Charleston the same thing in a Greensboro, in a DC, in a Sag Harbor, and then Detroit, and then God sent. I was struck over a lifetime of how not unique so many of these environments were. Forgive me, but the teacher in me poses to this group tonight a question that I always ask. Why is it that no matter what American city you go to, the same people are basically at the bottom and the same people are at the top? And no matter what city you go to in this country, and I say, I think you have two choices. Either this or there's something wrong with those black folks because they cannot get themselves together, or there is something systemically operating that makes that a reality. Play with it, which one you decide you're going to go with, but I don't think you have a whole lot of other choices.
I would disagree with that a little bit, and I would say that what's changed is You know, now you have Hispanics, now you have Haitians, now you have others who are at the bottom, and, you know, particularly now with he who shall not be named, you know, are demonized in a way that black people were, you know.
Well, I see that
decades
as
ago.
part of the same thing.
Right, but I was just gonna make the point that it's not just black folks anymore, it's
No,
others.
not just black Americans, you mean.
Yes,
But it's still black.
Cliff, and then Susan, and then.
Can I just make a comment to that last
Oh,
point?
okay.
I agree with everything you all just said, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that over time, to Millicent's point, over time, it's a consistent thing, because yes, in different ways of immigration, for a period of time, groups will be on the bottom, but there are also certain groups that, you know, forgive me if this sounds harsh, but are able to cash in on a white card that black people aren't able to cash in on, and eventually a few generations later, they are not the ones necessarily on the bottom anymore. And so, you know, the role that color plays in race and all of that, and to her point about how everywhere you go, it's that same pattern. And yes, new things happen, but eventually over time, it all settles, and it's the same pattern.
Well, I mean, there's that book, I can't remember the author's name, but there's that book called How the Irish Became White.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Because at one time, you know, there was a book I read about a woman, she's a northerner, and she marries a white slave owner, and she goes walking around the plantation, and she sees a gang of Irishmen and slaves working together on this project. And then it's like lunchtime, and the foreman says, okay, you Irish go stand over there, eat, and you blacks go over there. And one of the Irishmen gets up and goes and walks over and starts talking to one of the black people, and he shoos him over to go sit with the Irish. And she says, why did you do that? And he says, I don't want the blacks to learn bad habits from the Irish. So it's changed, but I think it's yet to be seen whether, as a group, Hispanics are gonna, are gonna become white.
But they do, Ted Cruz, I mean, like it's, not everyone, but because there are black Latinos who don't have that same privilege, but it's just something that I noticed over time.
I understand where you're coming from. I personally think the Indians, East Asians, South Asians, you know, they're gonna be white.
But they are technically Caucasian on their birth certificate.
Maybe, I don't know.
They are,
I don't know.
and that's how it's assigned.
Cliff,
Yeah.
and then Susan.
David, thank you for the presentation, everybody. David, I was struck by what you said about the letters that your family members wrote and how they did not mention race very much or maybe at all. And that reminded me of my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1894, and her father was enslaved when he was born, right? And I would ask my grandmother questions about this, and her response was always, I don't know, you know. And I think that was kind of emblematic of a certain widespread attitude among certain generations of Black Americans, not to just not dwell on slavery, right? Whereas today, I mean, I think it's pretty widely accepted that slavery is like, you know, understanding slavery is a vital part of understanding the Black American story. Whereas I think earlier generations maybe just wanted to move forward. So I'm wondering if anybody has ideas about when that shift occurred, right? When that shift occurred from just like wanting to put everything behind us to wanting to look back and connect the present with the past.
Boy, that's a great question, and I wish we had a real academic here to address it. I'm sorry. I stand corrected. I am duly chastised. But I'm tempted to wonder if it goes back to the Harlem Renaissance and maybe Langston Hughes. You know, because Hughes is one of the first popular writers who sees the beauty in, you know, the Black lower class. I don't know the answer to that, but I have noted that You know, I'm writing about as I say, my grandparents. And one of my great aunts wrote a family history that she had mimeographed and bound herself. And she said when she asked her father about those times, he just said, I don't remember, or just changed the subject. And so I think you're absolutely right. One other point, and that is a book that I found invaluable for my research was The History of the American Negro, South Carolina edition. And it's amazing to me how many people in that, and these are people, many of whom knew slavery, it's amazing to me how many people talk about they're descended from whites or they're descended from Indians. They you know, slavery is like off there someplace.
I just want to say very, very quickly, I think that the transition that you so aptly described happened different times for different people when the realization that black folks weren't responsible for slavery. And so as early as was noted, you know, it could have been the turn of the century as you hear about Du Bois and the other scholars of his time talking about embracing themselves as an African-derived people. But that doesn't come into the breadth of society. We don't, even in black society, we don't embrace it. You're talking about the 50s and the 60s. We're talking about black power. When people begin to identify, it's like, when do you throw off this responsibility and shame for a system that we were victimized by but not responsible for? Right. And I'm saying that that has happened at different times, you know, in different contexts.
Susan?
There's one element that I think is kind of missing in this discussion, and it feels like it's the political element. My daughter lives in Nashville, so the idea of urban versus rural and how that it affects politics. It happens in Atlanta, Fulton County. You know, Georgians are trying very hard every time there's a huge black population in Houston or in Georgia, that population, then about 100,000 votes get thrown out in Texas for no reason. And, you know, now Beto is trying to get them all back again. But what I'm trying to get at is that there seems to have been some kind of migration from the West and from the Northeast down into some of the South, some of the southern urban areas, which has changed something, at least of the political situation there. And also,
I sure hope so, but anyway.
well, Charleston, no, I have friends who live in Charleston,
Yeah.
and they say, you know, that, you know.
Let me say very quickly, because I said that in jest, but the point is, I'm telling you, as much as y'all might be messing up all the traffic, and I'm tired of all the overdevelopment, if you bring some enlightened ideas with you, you are welcome. What is happening, however, in many places throughout the South, we have Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, I'm sure even in Nashville, folks come and they drink the water. They take on some of the beliefs, or they kind of decide not to be quite so liberal once they get down there.
Not Nashville.
And they want to fit in, but well, sure, in Charleston, you know. And the appeal is enlightened thinking needs to be spread, you know. And so if you decide to move from one locale to the other, take your enlightened thinking with you, you know, because we need all the help we can get, you know. But unfortunately, I think that there is a phenomenon by which folks come, the snowbirds come, and, you know, we're glad, but they decide that they think that the plantation houses are all just wonderful, and they want to take the tours of the, you know, and all of a sudden Robert E. Lee is not such a bad guy, you know. It's like we just want to watch it, that if there is some enlightenment, we need to spread it around.
Linda, how many more questions?
Well, maybe we do one more question.
Laura and Charlie.
Just, I'll try to be really brief. You talked about people not wanting to talk about the difficult past of slavery. It doesn't, it applies to more than just blacks. Family who are Irish, they don't want to talk about it. It depends why you left and when, but people who left because of hardship, not because they not only seeking better opportunity, but kind of had to leave. They don't want to talk about the old country, right? I mean, for years and years, decades, Holocaust survivors, people who had left Europe, Jews who had left Europe, didn't want to talk about, couldn't talk about it. So I think it's not just, I mean, the Black experience is individual, it's different, but I think that is something more widespread among humanity, I guess, to say. And I almost feel ridiculous saying that, but saying this thing, but I think for a lot of people who aren't among the more well-read intellectual class, I think the looking back and coming to one's history happened with roots. The Alex Haley show. I mean, I think a lot of people saw that and said, wow, there's some interest back there.
Yes, but.
Of course. Yeah.
Because about the same time, there was a TV miniseries about the Holocaust, and I remember exchanging a letter. Gosh, I can Elie Wiesel and I exchanged a letter about it, and I said they did the same thing to you guys that Roots did to us. It's great that you had this popular show that people watched, but the nuance and some of I'm glad you brought up the Holocaust because I was reading something recently by a woman, she's a New Yorker, she edits a magazine called Jewish Currents, I think. And she's talking about her father just never talked about any of that sort of stuff, but it was obviously an ongoing trauma. And maybe that's the answer to why, our ancestors didn't talk about this because that was a trauma, okay? And there's this whole theory now that trauma can be inherited, and that's the idea that I've been really puzzling over. Has that come down over so many generations?
Yeah, epigenetics.
Does anyone want to add to that, or do we go to the next question? You, Charlie?
To give you the background, I'm a redneck from South Alabama. Okay? Accent, you're definitely not from my part of Alabama. Okay. But an observation question. The observation is first integrated organization we went into was the U.S. Army.
What year?
1960. And I've been to Columbia. We got a place called Fort Jackson. Fort Jackson, it's still Fort Jackson.
Yeah, both sides of my family had their land taken to build it.
And I'm seeing in this country the same kind of feeling of somehow our rights have been taken away from us.
White slang.
The same feel I felt in the 1960s in the South of Integrity. I don't quite understand how we got back to there. It's different folks that have got that feeling. So my question is, what do you think about a constitutional amendment where everybody has their DNA analyzed? Because I did 23andMe, and I need the Burundi computer.
I'm sorry.
I get my DNA done by.
Right.
Okay. In addition to being a little bit of Native American, I'm also somebody. My ancestors were from southeastern Africa.
That's been a story that's been going on for a really long time. And you may be able to correct me on the dates and whatnot. But at one point, when South South Carolina's revising the Constitution, 1895. They want to change the definition of who is black and who is white. Okay? And one of the, God, I can't remember the man's name, but he's the brother, he's a state senator, he's the brother of one of the most racist South Carolina governors. And he says, we can't change it, because if we change it, you're going to make many white people who are accepted into the best South Carolina society, you're going to make them black. So it's always been, but I think in earlier generations, people knew, because societies were smaller, people knew one another, and I think there were secrets kept.
Yeah, there were, but that got lost. And
Yes.
in my part of Alabama, I'm black. And look at me. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't dance for them.
Well, our new basketball skills.
No, football, yeah. And bro tie. Saturday. Jordan, no.
All right, I think we're ready to thank everyone. I'd like to just thank this incredible group. All three of these books were published in Columbia, South Carolina, by the University of South Carolina Press.
I'm just going to add a couple of other
Yeah,
factors.
but thank you to all of you. You came
Yes.
here from, where you live, and it really means a lot. It's great that you're part of this local book festival. I'm really, really pleased. And really better.
Well, yeah, we do want to thank the Brooklyn Book Festival, Stephen Herrera and Natalie Green, who are the Brooklyn Book Festival bookend co-chairs for helping us with this event and approving our application for this event. And then we also want to thank the Old Stone House for hosting, Kim Meyer, who couldn't be here tonight, who's executive director, Mal and Paul, who was filming and attended to all sorts of other details to make tonight possible. She's the director of programming. Also, Teresa Linehan, who you met downstairs when you came in. Louise Crawford, again, for moderating. Also, our colleague, Ed Valandra, who did the graphics that you saw on Eventbrite and that you might have seen on social media. And then, of course, the authors, three of whom traveled from the South. We have Pete Candler, who traveled from Asheville, North Carolina. And we have David Nicholson, who traveled from Vienna, Virginia. Deborah Clearman from Manhattan. Very far. And then we have Millicent Brown, who traveled from Charleston. So we have for attending.
Oh, and I just want to add a thank you to Alice Crawford, who's going to be selling books. And all the books are for sale. They're all $27, except for the novel, which is $19.
Right. And we also have more wine and more Pellegrino.
But thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.